What is up YouTube? This is Alex aka Foreign. So after a disappointing RX Vega launch from AMD, we enthusiasts are left waiting for Nvidia's Volta architecture as the next big and interesting thing. Sadly, we know close to nothing about it yet, except for the GV100, the world's largest GPU at 815mm squared, and a leaked photo of what seemed to be the Volta-based Titan card, which actually led to nothing later on. So I decided to turn on my speculatron and try analyzing what we already know about Nvidia's die sizes to look at what awaits us down the line with Volta. To do that, I made this nifty table with all of Nvidia's latest graphics cards, their GPU code names, and the respective die sizes. We'll look at cards starting from the X60 series up to the highest possible single chip ones. Let's start with likely Nvidia's most shameful release in recent years, the 400 series with Fermi. The full GF100 chip was 529mm squared and the cut down GF104 was 332, thus being around 40% smaller. After the 400 series, Nvidia was in dire need of improvements, but the architecture was at its limits. Thanks to some nifty software optimizations, they did manage to squeeze some juice out of Fermi once again. The chips in the GTX 500 series cards seem to be the same as in the 400 series, but according to Wikipedia they were different by a few square millimeters. Either way, the size difference between GF110 and GF114 is still around that 35% mark. Next came the Kepler-based 600 series cards, where every graphics card from the GTX 660 up to the flagship GTX 680 used the same mid-range GK104 GPU. It seems Nvidia was in a hurry to release the things, and with the performance jump to 28nm from 40, netting as much performance as it did, they managed things pretty well in this case. The GK104 was only 294mm squared. Then came the second iteration of Kepler, where Nvidia managed to again squeeze some extra performance via software optimizations. The GK104 was rebranded as the GTX 760 and 770 at 294mm squared, but the full-fat Kepler GK110 GPU came in at a whopping 561mm squared. Here Nvidia also introduced the Titan branding. The cut-down GK104 was around 50% smaller than the flagship GK110. After that came Nvidia's goldmine, the Maxwell-based 900 series. With the implementation of tile-based rasterization and some other software optimizations specifically tailored to improve gaming performance, the 900 series were phenomenal at performance per watt and noticeably faster than their predecessors. The GTX 960 is based on the 227mm squared GM206. It's important to note that there was no GX6 tier GPU in a meaningful mid-range tier before this. With Maxwell, Nvidia moved their stack down by one chip, with the GX6 now being not low-end, but mid-range. Next up is one of the most popular and controversial graphics cards ever, the GTX 970 with its 3.5GB of effective video memory. It was based on a cut-down mid-range GM204 at around 400mm squared, which is fairly large. The GTX 980 is based on the full GM204 chip. GM206 is around 50% smaller than GM204. And here Nvidia brought the big guns again, with the full-fat Maxwell GM200 GPU at a massive 600mm squared. The Titan X and GTX 980 Ti are based on GM200. GM204 is around 35% smaller compared to the flagship GM200. Now we're finally at the current generation, Pascal. The jump to 60nm took some time, but Nvidia managed very well. The now mid-range GP106 is only 200mm squared and it powers the GTX 1060. Next in line is the GP104, now high-end, powering the GTX 1070 and 1080 at 314mm squared. GP106 is 36% smaller than that. GP102 powers the highest enthusiast gaming cards, the Titan X's and the 1080 Ti, at 471mm squared. GP104 is 33% smaller than that. And finally, GP100, the flagship of all flagships. This GPU never made it down into the gaming segment for a few reasons. First of all, no competition from AMD, and secondly, possibly too high of a price due to HBM2 being part of the GPU package. So GP100 at a massive 610mm² stayed as a machine learning accelerator card only. GP102 is only 23% smaller than GP100. And now we're finally at Volta. We know that GV100, the full-fat Volta GPU, is the largest GPU chip ever made at 815mm². I am no GPU architect, so I can't say for certain, but part of that huge die size may come from the extra tensor cores Nvidia implemented into GV100 for machine learning and AI. That means that we're 100% not seeing this specific GPU in the gaming space. But Nvidia will most likely release smaller chips as both full and cut down versions of the Volta series GPUs. Now, if we look at the average percentage differences between the full-fat GX0 and GX4 chips from Nvidia, we will see that they are either in the 30 to 40% range for Maxwell and Fermi, or 50% for Pascal and Kepler. If we go by how Pascal and Kepler scaled down, then that would give us 407mm² GV104, which would be a fair bit larger than Pascal's 314mm² GP104. This means that in the long run, Nvidia will be earning less money for each Volta-based X70 and X80 class graphics card they sell than they are currently earning with the GTX 1070 and GTX 1080, because these are smaller GPUs. A GTX 1080 with a GP104 at 314mm² will earn Nvidia more money than a Volta-based GTX X80 card at 407mm² if they sell them at the same price. Their investors will definitely not approve of this though. That is why, if this is the case, if GV104 is noticeably larger than GP104, then expect even higher pricing for the next series of Nvidia's X80 and X70's graphics cards. On the other hand, if we're dealing with Maxwell and Fermi style die size scaling, then we're in trouble. In Maxwell and Fermi, we see that the GX4 tier GPU is only around 35% smaller than the full-fat GX0. That would mean that from 815mm² of GV100, we would go down to a massive 530mm² for GV104. That is almost 40% larger than GP104, larger even than GP102 inside the 1080 Ti and Titan X. That would be a massive GPU that Nvidia would never sell as an X80 tier card, as it's too costly to make and wouldn't earn them as much. That is why I feel in this case Nvidia would be forced to move their Volta-based X80 Ti and Titan V graphics cards down into the GX4 tier of GPUs, meaning these graphics cards will most likely have GV104 inside. In that case, X80 and X70 tier cards would have the GV106 chip. Unfortunately, if GV104 is in fact around 500mm², then that would be the only choice Nvidia would have, as they will not decrease their margins compared to the previous generation and displease the investors. Either way, it seems like Volta will in fact be even more expensive than the previous generation. Even if prices will be cheaper, they will most likely scale their high enthusiast tier X80 Ti and Titan V graphics cards down to the GV104 tier, with X80 and X70 tier cards being in the GV106 tier. Even if performance-wise these cards will be much faster than Pascal, we will live knowing that the high-end GV104 should have been much cheaper. In the best case scenario though, GV102 will lose a lot of its die space after removing the tensor cores packed in there for machine learning. If that's the case, then maybe all this won't be true, but who knows? Another case could of course be that Nvidia will pull a second Kepler and have only one GPU, for instance GV104, that they will then cut down from the X80 to the X60. I wouldn't bet on that though. This has been a pretty long video. If you've watched this through, I sincerely thank you. Let me know if you enjoyed this kind of analytical video by commenting or putting a like or dislike. If you want to see more stuff like this, subscribing is also a good option. Check the links in the description if you want to support the channel. You don't lose anything, but you support me at the same time. I thank you for your attention and hope to see you later.